Hey friend, and welcome back to the channel. Today, I'd like to talk about this game, Doom 3: Resurrection of Evil. Before we dive in, I just wanted to say thanks so much for watching, and if you enjoy this kind of content, please consider liking the video and subscribing. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the game and future videos, and your support in those future videos as well. I recently reviewed Doom 3 on the channel, and so if you want to hear my thoughts about that game, of course, go check it out. But I did have a little bit of a want to enjoy the gameplay of Doom 3 once again. So I decided that instead of starting a new file or anything like that, I would just move on to the expansion pack, Resurrection of Evil. So I hadn't played it before, but I did like this era of expansion packs. You know, whether it was this game, or you also had like Fear Extraction, for example, or Half-Life Episode 1 was kind of an expansion pack in a sense. This was kind of a big thing, and so it was cool that we got it on a physical copy on Xbox, and so I really did want to pick it up and give it a try and kind of see how they built up from Doom 3. You know, I hadn't played this before and wasn't even very familiar with it, so I had like fresh expectations going in and was hoping to see, you know, the style kind of revisited and revamped in a sense, and I'm excited to talk a little bit about my experience with that today. Really brief, the game is set about 2 years after the events of Doom 3 and follows a UAC Marine once again, who's been dispatched to kind of a remote Martian outpost to investigate a mysterious signal. Kind of sounds familiar in some ways, right? But now in Resurrection of Evil, the research facility is under the leadership of Dr. Elizabeth McNeil, who previously she had exposed the dangerous experiments at the heart of Doom 3's world. And so research operations have resumed, seem to be a little more under control. But during the investigation of this signal, the Marines come across an ancient artifact, and of course they have to go ahead and touch it. I mean, like, why not? But unfortunately for them, this does awaken a malevolent entity called Maledict, and triggers a whole new invasion from hell, plunging Mars into chaos once more. The expansion pack was released on Xbox in October of 2005 and was ported by Nerve Software, who also contributed to some other similar titles that were coming to the Xbox, like Return to Castle Wolfenstein and also Doom 3. And the game was published, of course, by Activision, who was taking the lead on id Software games at the time. So there was a notable contribution towards creating this game. You know, the expansion pack builds on id Software's id Tech 4 engine, which was originally led by John Carmack. And while Carmack, you know, he wasn't part of the game and he wasn't a lead on Resurrection of Evil, but his technical legacy really kind of lives on here and is deeply embedded in the game's DNA. Now, one funny thing that I did learn is that there is a new weapon in the game, which you'll experience if you play it, called the Grabber, and it works very similarly to the gravity gun in Half-Life 2. But the funny thing that I learned is that this was originally prototyped, apparently, during Doom 3's development and was later cut. And all of this development was kind of happening before Half-Life 2 really popularized the gravity gun. So, you know, the developers came and put it later back into this title and gave it some new mechanics such as time control and projectile catching abilities. But I did kind of find it funny that they didn't beat Valve to the punch on that one, and I wonder if both studios knew they were working on somewhat similar technology for their games. But not only that, but id Tech 4, you know, is also known for its dynamic lighting and shadow systems, which were cutting edge for the time. And while that is a big factor of the style that's in Doom 3, it does kind of create some performance bottlenecks on the console. We'll talk a little bit about that more in the review. But jumping back over to the game's story and narrative, just to continue to expand on that, the narrative is pretty straightforward, but it's also very atmospheric. So you're tasked with retrieving this mysterious artifact from a ruined UAC facility, and of course, as mentioned, only discover it's a gateway to hell. And along the way, you face off against new bosses, including a transformed Betrüger, who was kind of a menace in the original Doom 3 and who flew away at the end of Doom 3 as well. Of course, setting up what would become this expansion pack. There's some very cool themes here, you know, isolation, corruption, and the dangers of unchecked scientific ambition seem to continue to be at the front of kind of the thematic elements of Doom 3 and its expansion pack here. Mars is depicted not as like this frontier of hope, which I thought was pretty interesting. it's really kind of a cursed and inhospitable wasteland. And I really appreciated how the developers painted Mars as kind of evil and unwelcoming. Even when you're just like looking out a window, the planet feels hostile and oppressive, and it really adds to the atmosphere here in Resurrection of Evil. The story too is pretty non-linear. You know, it's scripted, it has some events in there that are just kind of by the book, and there is a little bit of environmental storytelling. There are no branching narratives, but the pacing and atmosphere does keep you invested, so I did quite like that. And the game isn't super long, of course. It's just an expansion pack, not really a full-on new title release. So, you know, it wasn't long enough to where I started to feel bored with where it was taking me. And this kind of is contributed to the factors of its dialogue. So the dialogue is pretty sparse, but it is functional. You know, audio logs here continue to exist, and there are brief character interactions. They do kind of serve more to build tension than to develop deeper character arcs, which these are less present in Doom 3. And aside from McNeil, who's kind of guiding us through this journey, we really don't hear from many other folks along the way, or any other folks, to be honest. So the story is pretty straightforward and honestly kind of forgettable by the big meat of the game, the ending. I kind of completed, and I looked back and I said, hey, how do I want to present this review, and what do I want to talk about for the story and the narrative? And honestly, I couldn't remember it, really. I had just played the game and it had already kind of passed me by. Now, I will say, too, that Doom 3, I think, does end on a pretty satisfying note. Of course, Betrugger flies away as like a little demon guy. But otherwise, I thought that things felt pretty settled and conclusive at the end of that title. So another reason why, from a story and narrative perspective, it wasn't really doing much for me. But of course, we don't necessarily play Doom games for a fantastic, deep story. You know, this isn't Mass Effect or something like that. We do it for the gameplay, and the gameplay here is pretty solid, and let's discuss that a little bit. So the core loop really revolves around exploring these dark corridors, you know, managing some limited resources, and surviving ambushes. So you're going to frequently backtrack to unlock new areas using these energy cells, which act as keys to unlocking new doors. And this was a new element that they introduced into the title that wasn't in Doom 3. And so I thought this was a pretty interesting addition. Mechanically too, you know, one of the first things I noticed was that the pistol now is equipped with a flashlight. So it's kind of a smart compromise. You know, it addresses the original Doom 3's criticism of having to switch between a flashlight and weapons. And now you're more forced to use the pistol if you want the visibility, which adds a layer of tactical decision making, and at least you have a gun available to you when you're in an engagement. But I did find that the super shotgun is easily the best weapon in the whole game. It's so fun to use and great to have here in the expansion, and so did have a blast with that. And there are a couple other mechanic additions. So I pointed out the grabber, and that's one I did want to talk about. The grabber is really a standout addition to this game. It functions really similarly to Half-Life 2's gravity gun, but it does have like a timed hold and the ability to catch and redirect projectiles. So it's kind of a great enhancement that opens up puzzle opportunities and makes explosive barrels, which I criticized in Doom 3 as being more like landmines than strategic items that you could take advantage of. You can actually use them now, because you can grab them and then you can shoot them away from you and kind of get them in a better position to explode. So instead of dying from constantly walking into them, like I was doing in Doom 3, you can weaponize them, which is what you would hope an exploding barrel could ultimately be used for, right? So we could have lived in a different world altogether if id Software put this in the first game and had the worked out functionality prior to that, but because of its existence, because of the way it functions, I will always think of Half-Life 2 when I play Doom 3 Resurrection of Evil, and you know, that's a pro and con. It works pretty similarly and gives some great functionality, but Doom 3 is a little more, Resurrection of Evil is a little more you know, condensed in its environments, so it's kind of harder to make that gravity weapon work to the extent it did in Half-Life 2, for instance. And so it kind of leads me to just saying, like, I want to go play Half-Life 2. So, you know, maybe that's something I'll do in the future. Who knows? A few other items I'll add here in the gameplay world. Navigation and world design is very different here from the way it was in Doom 3. So the exploration is more emphasized overall. And you're going to spend a lot more time hunting for these energy cells and backtracking through areas to kind of unlock new paths to move forward. And so while this did increase kind of the encounter density and allow for environments to be a little more small, I guess is the best way to put it, as a result, they do feel smaller and they do feel less complex because you're spending a lot more time running down the same hallways over and over again. And I'll be honest, you know, I didn't quite prefer this change. It felt kind of like a step back in the world building, especially since there's not much of that environmental storytelling to kind of flesh out over these areas, or an abundance of PDA audio logs. You know, they leave a lot of that extra goodies out of the title, and you're really just getting more gameplay on gameplay. But, you know, if you're going to make a 4 or 5 hour long expansion pack, we would hope that there's a little bit more to it than just, hey, we had this weapon that we scrapped from the first game, here it is now, congratulations. And so I do kind of wish that they stuck to the more linear level design in Doom 3, and they still do some nice things in Doom 3 to make it feel like you're not necessarily in that linear loop. But here, by just adding this addition of like, go find this key so you can unlock this door, doing it multiple times across the whole course of the game, just felt like a lot personally. So that's a little bit about the navigation and just the world that they've built for this game. From a UI interaction lens, I always find this to be super important because especially in a horror game, you want a UI that's not going to distract you from what's going on when you're playing the game, of course. So the HUD here, similar to Doom 3, does remain pretty minimal and functional still. You know, you got the health, you got your armor, you got ammo clearly displayed. And the PDA system does return for logs and objectives, but you spend a lot less time in it just because there's less audio logs and less locker code keys and such to scramble around for and utilize. So you'll spend much more time in the game. And so menus overall stay pretty straightforward, though not particularly modern by today's standards, as you can imagine. It's kind of an old school feel still to kind of opening up this PDA and it loads, and of course on the console it takes a little bit of extra time. So that is something to consider. However, it didn't so much impede gameplay in the way that it did constantly in Doom 3, which I appreciated. Overall then, I really love when developers kind of step out on a lens and decide, hey, we're going to try something new and do something different. And they did that in Doom 3 Resurrection of Evil. They added new weapons, they addressed some criticisms both from critics and fans of the title, such as with the pistol and light a combination, and so I thought it was nice that they did that. And some of the ways that they cut back in order to make those innovations possible, such as in the storytelling realm, building an interesting narrative of like what's going on 2 years after in this Mars world. They didn't do too much for me here, but I did like the gameplay additions, and that is what I wanted to satisfy the most. I mentioned that I wanted to go back and replay Doom 3 just so I could like run through the corridors and blast on some enemies. And this game delivered, and it added a couple of little enhancements, a couple of new items, the super shotgun, the grabber, that make it just play a little different, and also opens up new avenues for new types of enemies, and enemies that you can't duck so easily out on, so they actually seem a little more dangerous to you as the player. So I did quite like that, and the gameplay was what I was going for here. And it delivers, more or less. So, next thing I want to talk about is the sound. So sound is always important in a game, of course. And let's start with just the little aspects of what Resurrection of Evil is dishing out to us as the players. The first of those being voice acting. So overall, we get some solid performances from industry veterans. So we have Jennifer Hale here, who's been in way too many games to name, I'll be honest. And also Steve Blum. Steve Blum, he's been in Mass Effect 2, Red Dead Redemption 2, God of War. Like, both of these folks are super legends, and so they lend a lot of credibility to what sparse dialogue is in here for Resurrection of Evil. I just thought it was cool to see their names in the credits. So yeah, good solid voice acting, gets the job done. From a sound effects lens, the sound design for me continues to be one of the game's most important and strongest aspects. You know, every door creak, demon growl, weapon discharge, everything sounds super crisp and atmospheric. And I always really loved when I played these games just how nice it was, and I mentioned this in the Doom 3 review too, that if I heard an enemy I knew exactly what enemy it was just because I'd become familiar with the type of movements they make and the sounds that they emit. I just found it to be really impressive. It's just one of those things that I don't think you see in games quite frequently. So, and that is paired with a great quality of sound, which is nicely stereo mixed, which really enhanced my immersion sitting in the den, just playing the game, or with headphones on, which I did on occasion as well. So just overall, very fun. And that comes with a really good soundtrack, which leans heavily into ambient horror, industrial tones, eerie silence. All these things punctuate and create just very nice, sudden musical stings to complement the quite fun combat. And so overall, just great sound design, great sound work. And so again, I don't know who exactly was leading the charge in these effects for the game, but they did a great job. Last major item I want to point out is by 2005 standards, Doom 3's engine was still very impressive, and Resurrection of Evil continues the legacy with this really nice dynamic lighting and detailed textures that were available in ID Tech 4 at the time. So, however, I will say that I did notice a number of performance issues when playing this title on the Xbox. These were particularly present during opening cutscenes and loading screens. Things did mellow out a little afterward, but there were still some moments of lag and stuttering during high combat sequences. So the lack of optimization for me was kind of surprising, though also somewhat expected given hardware limitations. And then now they're really pushing the edge by creating these physics objects, allowing you to pick them up and throw them around, etc. But I was very surprised that the opening sequences and the opening cutscenes especially were where it was most noticeable. This is somewhere I would think that you would prioritize most of your time if you really wanted it to come out clean and looking good, because the opening segments are what players are going to most likely see. If there's a little bit of combat here where some of the encounters aren't perfectly optimized and you kind of lag out a little bit, in 2005, that is something that one would expect because they're likely playing on their dad's hand-me-down laptop or playing on the Xbox. That's normal. But to see it right out the gate, that's a little bit much. But I did think that the game overall, artistically and also in its technology, still looked very cool to this day, 20 years later. And so I was impressed by that. Leaving it mostly there, I just want to wrap up and give you some concluding thoughts. Doom 3 Resurrection of Evil is a very solid expansion that builds on the strengths of its predecessor, while introducing meaningful gameplay tweaks that I think both address criticisms, fan criticisms, but also enhance the gameplay that already existed and add some new fun weapons in and such. So the flashlight combo with the pistol is a great example of that. It's a very thoughtful response to the feedback. And again, that grabber, adds that layer of strategy. However, I will say that the increased backtracking and kind of smaller feeling environments do detract from the sense of scale and complexity of the title. And they're also paired with some performance issues on Xbox, which are hard to ignore, honestly, especially when they're right in the opening. But the atmosphere, especially the depiction of Mars as this truly evil place, does remain haunting and effective. And so that's what I really did appreciate about Resurrection of Evil, and some of the things that I thought could have been improved overall. I'm sure in 2025, if you go ahead and play this on PC, you're not going to notice some of these things. But the thing that I love about being able to go back and play it on original Xbox, for example, is that, it's not going to look the best. It's not going to play the best. And that's fine, because it's going to be the way I kind of remember the Doom 3 games playing. There's a lot to that for me personally, and so I get a lot out of playing these titles on original hardware. So that's okay if it's a little little lag here or there. Doesn't look as fancy as like 4K up-res outputs and stuff like that. I had a lot of fun playing Doom Resurrection of Evil in this way, and recommend you give it a try. It's pretty cheap on Xbox, honestly, to pick this up, and you don't need to have Doom 3. I mean, I would recommend to play Doom 3, but if you just wanted to pick this one up, you could totally do that too. It's pretty cheap. So overall, I would say that if you're a fan of survival horror shooters and want more out of Doom 3, haven't played this expansion pack before, it's definitely worth your time. Just be prepared for a few bumps along the way, but I thought that they did a lot of cool stuff to enhance the gameplay and address some feedback too in this title. And it's just kind of cool to get a little more out of Doom 3, new levels, new enemies, and new fun, so to speak. So I did want to say thanks again so much for watching. If you liked the video, again, please like the video and consider subscribing to the channel. Love to bring you some content. Love to hear your thoughts and feedback on some of the games I'm playing. Otherwise, stay well, stay healthy. I'll see you guys on the next one. All right, peace.